Hello everyone, this is Bill. If you keep getting beat at chess and you don't know why, it's probably because you're violating one of the opening principles you're about to learn. Principle number 1 is to try to control these 4 central squares with pieces or pawns. That's why the 4 most common first moves for white is either knight to f3, which hits the e5 square, or e4, which hits the d5 square, d4, which hits this square, and c4 can also hit the d5 square. Knight to c3 is possible, but has some disadvantages, which we'll talk about another time. If your opponent allows it, you'd love to have both of the e4 and d4 pawns 2 squares forward. The same would be true for black if your opponent allows you to take the e5 and d5 squares. The reason for this central occupation is that in the center your pieces have the maximum number of squares they can move to, which means they'll have more opportunity for attack and defense, which is why you develop your knight here and not here, because from here he has 8 squares he can move to and only 4 from here. Principle number 2 is to develop your pieces in preparation for castling and to get your men out so they can fight. One of your goals is to penetrate enemy territory, which is this half of the board. If you draw an imaginary line here, you want to get closer to the targets. And you want to develop your pieces as quickly and efficiently as possible. That's why if you move pawn to e4, for example, this allows the bishop to come out and also the queen. Pawn to d4 allows this bishop to come out, which is the second reason these 2 pawn moves are the most common first moves in chess. It's usually recommended for beginners to play a lot of games with e4 because these games tend to be more tactical, more quickly. So go to the playlist on the 12 tactical themes if you haven't watched those yet. Your tactical ability is one of the first things you need to develop in chess. And the way to find those tactics you can find on the video on the 6 power moves of chess or how to find chess tactics. Okay, principle number 2 says to develop your pieces as quickly and efficiently as possible in preparation for castling and to get your men out so they can fight, which means to get your knight out and your bishop out so your king can castle. In most chess games, players castle on the king side because it's a lot quicker, but there are times to castle queen side, which I'll do another video on later. Also extremely important, and perhaps the most important thing, is to not move your pieces out mindlessly and to always ask, what is the threat? Why did my opponent make his last move? Is he threatening to attack a higher ranked piece with a lower ranked piece? Is he attacking an undefended piece? Is he attacking my queen? You have to answer these questions before you move. Because right out of the opening, threats are happening. They're either strategic threats, positional threats, or tactical threats. I mean, even this first move, e4, is actually a threat for white to play d4 and establish 2 pawns in the center. That's one of the reasons black plays e5, to not allow this pawn to establish itself there. And then with white's second move, knight to f3, what's the threat? Black has to ask, what is the threat? Well, he's attacking this undefended pawn. And then let's say the knight comes out and defends this pawn. And then the bishop comes to b5. He has to ask, is there a threat? A threat to lose material. Remember, either a threat to be checkmated and then the threat to lose material. Those are the 2 most important things. So if white plays bishop takes knight, which is the tactic called removing the guard, well then white would be free to capture this pawn. Of course, nothing is easy in chess, and there's always a rebound effect, and black has ways of maybe recapturing this pawn. But nonetheless, you have to be very alert and always ask, what is the threat? And conversely, you should be making threats with virtually every move you make. And the better you get, the more you learn about strategy and tactics, the more you'll be able to do that. Of course, the most important thing is to have fun, lose a lot of games, learn the hard way. If you play someone of equal ability, they're going to make mistakes too, and you'll have equal chances. Which leads us to principle number 3, opening principle number 3, which states bring your knights out before your bishop. One of the reasons for this is that we normally know where the knight belongs. On f3 it has its most mobility, and the knight here on f6. with exceptions. There are exceptions to all rules in chess, which makes it so much fun. It's a game full of creative potential. But these are guidelines that will hold true in most situations. The bishop has options. He could move here, he could move here. It's because the knight moved here that the bishop had a reason for coming to b5. Which brings us to principle number 4, which is to castle. White is ready to castle now. Say black comes here, and white can castle. You want to get the king out of the center because it's usually the place where a lot of the action is, and the king will be very vulnerable there. I know at this moment some of you are noticing, hey, but you left this undefended pawn here, and this knight can capture it. Not to worry. There's a way to get your material back. For example, knight takes pawn. Rook can come here now. Notice this X-ray. This is called an X-ray when a piece, you want to look at the influence that a piece has all the way through the other pieces that are in its way. And you see the king on the other side of this X-ray of the rook. And the knight is undefended. A key point. That's power move number 3. Go look at the video on tactics, on how to find tactics. And whatever black does, if he moves this knight back, then we'll have 2 attackers on this pawn, the knight and the rook, and we'll win it back. If he defends the knight with this pawn, we can bump him away with the little guy harassing big guy, which is power move number 5. The knight will have to run, and then we'll win this pawn. And not only that, but the black king will be in big trouble. That's why you've got to castle. The next principle states, don't bring your queen out too early without justification. For example, it's very tempting for white to try to go for an immediate mating attack, but that'll only work on very inexperienced players. So let's say he comes here and the bishop comes here. Let's say he makes moves his knight out here. Then the queen sliding here is threatening mate immediately on this pawn, this f7 pawn. The problem is that it's very easily parried. For example, black can block it. And now the knight doesn't have its ideal square here on f3. And the queen is just in the wrong place. That's another thing you should ask yourself before you move is, how can my opponent stop my threat? And if you can see a very easy way for him to stop you, you might realize that your move is not a very good one. And the other reason you don't want to bring your queen out early is that it's very easy to attack her with lower ranked pieces. And she'll just have to run, and in the process your opponent gets to develop his lower ranked men, and he'll have a force majority at some point and be able to go on an attack. So don't bring your queen out early, unless of course your opponent makes a mistake. And then you might have good reason to come out and win material. Opening principle number 6 states, don't move the same piece twice in the opening before castling without justification. There are exceptions to all rules, remember, and if your opponent makes a bad move that allows you to go on the attack, then you can violate the opening principles, which I'll be repeating. Almost nothing is easy in chess, and it's difficult to punish opening violations, but you need to be aware of them and not do them because better opponents will be able to punish you for violating them. In this game, we see black moving the same piece twice here. Let's get to that position. Okay, now black has moved the knight twice, and white needs to figure out how he can punish him. He has different options, and in this game he chose to grab more of the center with e4. Now the queen slid down here attacking this pawn, threatening mate in 1. So white needs to defend that. And he blocked with pawn to g3. The queen ran. She has to keep defending this knight because the queen's on it. And now white pinned this knight. He's got 2 attackers on it. f5 defending the knight. And now white needs to figure out how he can win that knight, if possible. Plays h3, but it isn't immediate because this rook is undefended. If he captures, the queen will be able to capture the rook. The bishop slides here with a pin. Pawn takes. Black recaptures. And now the bishop defends the rook so that on the next move this pawn can take the knight. And now the queen gets out of the pin and white will be free to capture this knight. and with good play, white should win with no problems. But as you can see, it wasn't easy to punish this violation of principle. Which leads us to the last opening principle, number 7, which states, don't block your center pawns with pieces. You want these two pawns, the king and queen pawns, to be able to move forward. For example, in a typical opening here, let's say e4, e5, knight to f3, and knight to f6. Some novices might try to defend this pawn by placing the bishop here. Moves like that should be avoided because this pawn can't move, and it reduces the options for this bishop because it'll take a long time for him to be able to get out on this diagonal. And these little errors tend to compound, and before you know it, you have a real strategic disadvantage, and your opponent is able to launch a successful attack. So follow these opening principles. Always ask, what is the threat? Make sure you see the threats that your opponent is posing on you and defend against them or launch a superior counterattack, and you'll see your game improving immediately. I hope you got something out of this, and I'll see you on the video on strategic goals.